I'm Hallie Jackson in New York with a breaking news special report. Donald Trump on trial, super close to the finish line here, with prosecutors right now taking a quick break, but rounding the corner on the final stretch of their closing argument to those 12 New Yorkers, asking them to make history, convict a former president, and Republicans pick to be the next one. I want to show you here Mr. Trump and one of the breaks we've gotten on this very long day so far. So far, 6 hours of closings in a case that centers around these 34 felony counts that Mr. Trump lied on business records to cover up alleged hush money payments to former adult film star Stormy Daniels for an affair that Mr. Trump denies. Now, prosecutors say this is election interference, but it's the defense who spoke first, setting up their argument in 3 big buckets, if you will, and the prosecution had an answer for all of it. So here's the Reader's Digest version. First, you had Trump defense attorney Todd Blanche saying, wait a second, you can't convict Donald Trump because those documents are not lies, they're legal retainers to former Trump fixer Michael Cohen. Prosecutors say, well, no, those documents are illegal, part of a literal mountain of evidence. The defense painting one picture of who Mr. Trump is, this guy who's way too busy to be part of a scheme like this. They say, after all, he was the president. The prosecution, in its response, reminding the jury this didn't just start with that 2017 meeting at the White House. This began years before with schemes to, in their words, catch and kill stories to help him get elected. So it all comes down to this guy, Michael Cohen, right here. Mr. Trump's former attorney, the star witness, the man who was in the room where it allegedly happened. The defense going after Cohen's credibility big time, calling him the MVP of liars, the gloat, the greatest liar of all time. The defense says those lies are proof the jury cannot rely on Michael Cohen, but prosecutors had a different name for him. They say they didn't pick Cohen up at the witness store. He's here because Donald Trump chose him to be his fixer, instead calling Cohen the tour guide. Through the physical evidence, who gives the context of this case. Now, through all of this, you had this split-screen moment outside court as this was happening inside, because outside you had the Biden campaign sending a very famous surrogate of sorts, Robert De Niro, in for this split-screen moment. Look at this. De Niro, we're about to show you at one point, getting into it with Trump supporters. Then you had later Mr. Trump's son trying to light things up himself. We're going to get there in a second. But for the next 25 minutes, we will wrap up this trial, breaking down these closing arguments as they happen and asking now, what is next? Our team of reporters and legal and political experts are here to break it down. I want to start with Rahima Ellis, who is outside court. So real quick, Rahima, just timing-wise, it is 5:01 Eastern right now. What's the status with court still going on as we speak?
Yeah, it is. They've taken a break. They took a break maybe about 3 minutes ago. It's going to be a 20-minute break. And the judge says they're going to come back because he says it looks like the jurors, that they are still pretty alert. So it looks like this thing could go until 7 o'clock this evening if it doesn't finish before then. And if it seems like it's going to take longer, the judge says he's going to make an assessment of the jurors to try and figure out if they're going to finish for the day. It seems like the judge would really like to finish these arguments in terms of the closing arguments now from the prosecution so that he can then present his charge to the jury tomorrow, and this jury can get this case and begin deliberating on it. They've been going so far now, Hallie, as far as the prosecution is concerned, for 2 hours and 45 minutes. Earlier in the day, the prosecution said it would take him anywhere from 4.5 to 5 hours maybe, but he said that would depend on what that closing argument was from the defense. And some of what we've been hearing from the prosecution, it is tick-tock in terms of line by line and email by email in his effort to show that this was not just a one-off on Michael Cohen's part, because the defense made a big deal of trying to show that this thing all hinges on Michael Cohen, and Michael Cohen is a liar, not someone to be believed. The prosecution is trying to restore Michael Cohen's credibility, if you will, by showing that he's not the only one who was engaged in what the prosecution is calling a conspiracy. And even at one point, when they talk about that HELOC, the home equity loan that Michael Cohen took out to pay $130,000, Steinglass says this was written down as a real estate deal. Steinglass is saying yet another falsification of records. Again, had he filled out the form, the bank might not have opened this account. This wasn't a retainer. It was a payoff. Hallie?
So, Rahima, the judge is saying just in the last couple of minutes here, he hopes to try to finish up closings tonight, if possible, before giving jury instructions, presumably tomorrow morning. And then, of course, it is in the hands of those 12 New Yorkers. What else stands out to you throughout the day as we look ahead to tomorrow and what is potentially the beginning of the end for this trial this week?
This jury has got to really decide. I guess that's the case in any legal case. Who do they believe in the arguments? Which ones are most convincing? Who makes a greater and most persuasive presentation? Take a look at this in terms of what the Trump defense team said earlier today. They said they did not try to inflame your emotions. They did it to try to embarrass President Trump. And that is what the prosecution's case is all about. The prosecution, on the other hand, is saying through Joshua Steinglass about Stormy Daniels in particular, if her testimony were so irrelevant, why did they work so hard to discredit her? In the simplest terms, Stormy Daniels is the motive of why all of this was going on, why Michael Cohen had to take out that $130,000 to pay off Stormy Daniels in order to keep her quiet from telling her story, which you know was coming so close on the heels of the release of the Access Hollywood tape. And Hope Hicks herself had testified that the campaign was in somewhat of a meltdown because of this. This was very important that they had to silence Stormy Daniels, according to the prosecution. Hallie?
Rahima Ellis live for us there in downtown Manhattan. Rahima, thank you very much. Let me bring in some of our legal experts here. NBC News analyst Danny Savalos, Georgetown law professor Michelle Goodwin. It is good to be back with you here on this Tuesday. The gang has reassembled, if you will. Danny, let me start with you and the former president's defense, because there was this kind of catchy moment where Todd Blanche laid out what he described as a top 10 list, or the top 10 reasons why there should be reasonable doubt. You see the reasons here. I think in the eyes of some legal experts, a few of these seem stronger than some others, if you will. Gimmicky, in your view, or is this what you need to keep a jury's attention during a long day?
Definitely not gimmicky. Lists like this, usually a little shorter in my comfort zone, but lists and bullet points, those are key. You want to really hit the jury with something they can remember when they go back there. Now, is a list of 10, and if you can throw that back up there, with those 10, some of those you probably could have consolidated. I think 3 and 4 was like no intent to defraud, not much intent to defraud. I mean, I'm paraphrasing and I'm being glib here, but some of those points could have been combined, I think. Yeah. But very critical to use those kinds of things. You see the prosecution, they came out and did the exact same thing. They opened with 3 key points. Yep. And many folks know the rule of threes. I don't know if it's cosmic or psychological or what it is, but there is a general rule that things in threes are more easily memorized than a list of 10. But at the same time, if a juror is looking for one item to hang their hat on, 10 items is arguably 7 better than 3, if my math is right.
Well, I'm not a math major, Danny, but I think the fact check on that one is true. So, Michelle, let's talk about those sort of 3 reasons from the prosecutors, if you will, the rule of threes Danny was talking about, that there were false business records, number 1. Number 2, that those records were intended to cover up a conspiracy related to the election. And number 3, that Donald Trump himself was involved. Did they do what they needed to do so far to convince a jury that those 3 things are accurate?
They've done so in a non-rushed way with a narrative arc, and people like stories. And in this narrative arc that they've done, they have gone back through the beginning of the trial to remind jurors why they're there. They've reminded them of prior testimony, compelling prior testimony, not just what Michael Cohen brought forward, but we have also those who testified from the Inquirer, those who testified that were part of the president's transition team and served in the White House. So this has been a very deliberate, methodical work that we've seen from the prosecution side today.
Let me ask you, Danny, about this so-called empty chair argument that you and I have talked about, just to pull back the curtain, in our office here upstairs at 30 Rock, because you're interested in it. The people that were not called here, somebody like former Trump org CFO Alan Weisselberg, who could potentially be critical in putting Donald Trump, right, more directly tying Donald Trump to the scheme that prosecutors allege. Right now, it's just Michael Cohen's word for it, and the defense has been very clear what they think of Michael Cohen's word. Very little.
I thought not only was this an important argument, I felt like the defense didn't make enough of that argument. I felt like they could have devoted less time to just saying Michael Cohen lies and more time to something like the absence of an Alan Weisselberg, the absence of a Keith Schiller, who was the bodyguard to Donald Trump, the absence of his sons. You see one of his sons right there. Their involvement, they have a tangential involvement here. None of them were called. I think I might have focused more on that and maybe a little less on the Michael Cohen is a liar. Don't get me wrong. I would have hit that hard. You have to, because that's what you do with cooperating witnesses. The prosecution owns all their credibility issues, and you have to really hammer them home that they're insurmountable.
Michelle, now all the attention, right? It is in the hands of these 12 New Yorkers, these 12 people, as the defense is looking to convince them not to convict Donald Trump. The prosecution is looking to get them to convict former President Trump. We're showing them to you again here, the teacher, the salesman. Interestingly, a couple of attorneys here, those are spotlighted among these 7 men and 5 women who make up this jury. Could you see the ways, Michelle, that both sides were maybe trying to tailor their arguments to the jury specifically? We talked about some of the rhetorical flourishes, the top 10, the top 3, et cetera. What else?
That's right. Well, in trying to paint Michael Cohen and spending so much time as a person who is untrustworthy, that he has no credibility, that this is a political witch hunt, is something that plays in the year of an election. So that's what the defense was trying to do, albeit they have been scrambling his defense attorneys across multiple investigations and multiple indictments. On the other hand, what the prosecution has tried to do is to relay that what this is about something that nobody can be above the law with, that nobody can falsify business records, and most importantly, Americans can't be duped in the time of an election. And this is what the former president was trying to do. He was trying to act fraudulently such that Americans couldn't get a fair chance at who they wanted to elect in 2016.
Michelle Goodwin, Danny Savalos, thank you very much. 5:11 Eastern time here in New York, with that trial happening just several blocks, about a mile or so far downtown in Manhattan here. We will see what happens at 7 p.m. That is the next pivot point for Judge Merchan. I want to bring in 2 people who know the former president well, his former attorneys, Michael Vanderveen and Bill Brennan. Good to have you both. Bill, thank you for joining us here on set. Michael, I'm sure we'll see you tomorrow. That is my hope. Bill, let me start with you. Would you feel confident, based on what you heard from Todd Blanche, that you got the job done if you were him today?
I think he did. I mean, it's important to remember that he has to encapsulate a month-plus trial into shortly over 2 hours.
2 hours and 57 minutes, yeah.
And, you know, he has to, it's a balancing test. I'm sure he's tempted to spend 2 hours and 29 minutes on Cohen's a liar, but you have to check those boxes for the other evidence that came in. And I heard Danny say, you know, about the missing witness, which is important issue. He could have hit it harder, but, you know, there's no burden shifting in a criminal case. The prosecution is not supposed to be able to get up and say, well, they could have called him. But if you really hit it too much with Judge Merchan, he may give them a little more than they should have. So I think Mr. Blanche did a good job at balancing the equities here. But in my opinion, it really does come down to Cohen.
Flip side of the coin, though, 2 hours and 57 minutes, Michael. Was it too long? Was it too, quote unquote, meandering, as some critics have suggested?
Well, you know, that really depends upon each case and what the lawyer in the courtroom is seeing. Blanche's experience at giving closings, and, you know, we all like to hear ourselves talk. So it's quite possible that he was reading the jury and figured he could keep going long. You know, it's interesting for the client to sit there and hear the closing from your defense. You feel great. When Steinglass jumps up and starts his closing, it's a completely different feeling in that courtroom.
You say something funny, Michael. You say for the client to sit there and listen to the defense. It is not just any client. It is Donald Trump. It is the former president of the United States, and it is somebody who really cares, who really gives a damn about the way that his attorneys represent him. Bill, you know this well. Michael, I know you know this well, too. Give us a sense of how you think Blanche did as it relates to the conversations he might be having with Mr. Trump now, right? The closings are over or about to be over here. Because I wonder how much of what you heard was Todd Blanche making a case to the jury, those 12 men and women, and how much was Todd Blanche making a case to the one defendant sitting at the table behind him? I
would say that anything said to one particular person, in this case, Mr. Trump, was de minimis. Mr. Blanche is a professional. He did a spectacular job defending Mr. Trump in this case. And he did what Mike and I did at the impeachment and in the payroll company trial before Judge Merchan. We showed the respect we would show to any client. It's a little different when your client used to run the world for 4 years, but we did our jobs as if it was Donald Duck. It didn't matter.
Did you make anything of that moment towards the end of the defense's closing when there was a suggestion by Todd Blanche that the jury would decide whether or not to send Mr. Trump to prison? We heard Judge Merchan sort of, there was an objection raised. There will be some curing to the jury on that piece of it, that because, you know, it's not the jury's job. They don't decide what the sentence is.
Correct.
The sentence could simply be a fine. We just don't know. We can't speculate at this point.
But really, it's a bit of a legal fiction. On the one hand, you say, well, it's not within the province of the jury to worry about penalty. There's a charge that says, you know, make your decision not to avoid an unpleasant duty or to show favor. That's all great. Everybody sitting in that jury box knows that in a criminal case, it could result in prison time. So if he said it, it was most likely in the heat of passion, inadvertent. And to tell them that he could face prison is nothing they don't know already.
Michael, to you here, because the prosecution is still going. We have heard now from Mr. Seinglass for several hours. There is a suggestion they're going to go till 7 o'clock once the jury gets back in the room, kind of see where they are and go from there. It is obviously the rule in this particular courtroom, in this court, that prosecution gets the last word, right? So the jury is left with the words of the prosecutor. Mr. Trump clearly does not like that based on his Truth Social posts. That's just the way it goes. If you're sitting at that defense table with him, are you hearing anything from the prosecution that's giving you cause to be nervous? Are you hearing anything where you're going, man, that's a good point, and we just couldn't combat it?
Well, I'll tell you, first of all, Josh Steinglass is a tremendous closer. I've sat and I've listened to him close, so he really knows what he's doing. He had a lot of time, 5 days to prepare this closing. And the thing about closings is, you know the case cold by the time you close. You know everything that was allowed in, and you know everything that was not allowed in. And that is really crucial to the closing. But I think that sitting there, the defense is really in a position where they're just waiting for it to wrap up. You know, they know what he's going to say. Steinglass has said everything they thought he was going to say, and they're just waiting for this to wrap up, get the instructions, get their verdict.
You say get the instructions like it's simply a box to check. I know you know how important that is. Explain to our viewers. The jury instructions could be critical here tomorrow morning.
Sure. The jury instructions are absolutely critical because they're the law. And when the judge instructs the jury, he tells them how to take the facts of this case and apply the law to them. And I know that he was very careful when I closed in front of him, and he was very careful today to say, I'm the guy who instructs the jury. I don't want you folks talking about the law. I will be doing that. And it's absolutely crucial because he's in a position to frame the law with the facts, and it's a very small margin between.
Mike, I'm sure you'll agree because we've discussed this. This particular case, similar to our case, could rise and fall on a nuanced sentence in an instruction. It's not like, robbery is an unlawful taking or murders. This is going to be, if they find that this was it done for the benefit of the campaign, for the benefit of the marriage, for both, it really could rise or fall on one sentence in an instruction. Is that important?
Critical 24 hours?
Yeah, Bill,
go
you're
ahead.
absolutely.
All right, Michael Vanderveen, Bill Brennan.
I was just going to say.
Not shocking to hear both of you in agreement, I would say. I appreciate you both being with us. Thank you so much. Lots to discuss in this very important 48 hours, obviously, in this trial. Thank you both. I want to get to the politics now with Dasha Burns, who covers all things Trump campaign. She is live for us in downtown Manhattan. What was interesting here, Dasha, we noted it at the top of the show, this split screen moment, because as all this drama is unfolding inside of court during closing arguments, as our guests have just talked through, outside court, you had the Biden campaign getting more aggressive than we've seen them, really this whole trial, bringing out this idea of this sort of high-profile surrogates, Robert De Niro, former Capitol Police officer, current Harry Dunn, who was running for Congress unsuccessfully. And I should note here, too, I'm being told by our team that court is now back in session, so we'll look from notes from inside the room. But, Dasha, talk us through that piece of it here, how you see the politics of it.
Well, look, the Biden campaign, according to reporting from our colleagues Mike Memley, Monica Alba, Natasha Korecki, they have felt handcuffed by this trial. It has sucked up so much of the oxygen, and we know that they have been planning to get more aggressive after the trial. Of course, the trial is not over, but this was a big media moment that they tried to take advantage of to set up that contrast, making the argument via Robert De Niro and some Capitol Police officers that were there on January 6th that the former President Trump is a threat to democracy. And then on the other side, you had the Trump folks. You had his spokespeople and also his son, Don Jr., and Eric Trump, and his wife, Laura Trump, who's now one of the co-chairwoman of the RNC, come out here and give their side of the story, saying, look, this is political persecution. We've, of course, heard that before, that this is election interference. And you have both of those camps outside of the courtroom. Meanwhile, the legal stuff that's actually going to impact, the future of the former president is going on inside the court. Really interesting split screen, Hallie.
There's also this question, and everybody wants to know it. How does this trial affect the presidential campaign, the race for the White House now, as we are closing in on the first debate on both the Republican and the Democratic conventions? It's kind of a question mark, candidly, because you poll people about how they feel about a hypothetical. Yeah. It's one thing. You poll people about something that actually happens, like once we do eventually get a verdict, it's another. But there are some interesting signals here as it relates to independence. So we're looking at these numbers here. We're showing them on screen, Dasha. And I want to point people to the very last row there, independent voters. If Donald Trump is convicted, would you be more or less likely to vote for Donald Trump? 23% of them say they'd be less likely to do so. Now, this is critical because we know that these margins are going to be very close in this race in November. So, a few percentage points here or there could swing it. Is the Trump campaign sweating this at all?
Well, they won't publicly let anyone see them sweat, right? You know this well. But you can see some of the signals in the messaging. We got a fundraising email yesterday where the email asked voters, would you vote for me if I were arrested? We need 1 million responses by midnight to show that you're going to stay with the former president. This is their attempt to sort of dispel the notion that some people would change their minds were a conviction to happen. I'll tell you that anecdotally, Hallie, as I've been talking to voters, you're right, most people either are convinced that he's a criminal or think that this is persecution. But there are people that I've talked to that haven't been paying super close attention that have said, it would be maybe a little bit tough to vote for someone that has, convicts, that has that criminal record next to their name. So it's an open question, but an important one.
Dasha Burns, thank you very much. Let me bring in now for the big picture, Brian Stelter, a special correspondent for Vanity Fair. On all things, Brian, media, how this coverage is affecting the campaign, because it may be. Let me pull back up some of that video of Robert De Niro, because he spoke. We'll play that in just a second. Got into it, too, with some of the pro-Trump protesters who were outside court, who have been there sort of demonstrating in support of former President Trump. Look at this moment. There's profanities apparently flying back and forth. In this sense, did Donald Trump get what he wanted to some degree, which was a bit of a spectacle?
I think that's true by the end of the trial. As the weeks have gone on, more of Trump's family members have joined him at court, so have GOP lawmakers. And now, as of today, the Biden campaign is trying to retaliate in some ways, putting on a spectacle outside the courthouse as well. But what was De Niro there to talk about? January 6th and Trump's threat to democracy. Biden's campaign wants to pivot to other topics, right? They want to make this about the rule of law without actually talking about the current trial underway. But as Dasha just said, if Trump is found guilty, Biden can go on for the rest of the year calling him a convicted felon. That's ultimately maybe why this will matter in November, if it does matter at all.
We talked about, and our team is reporting more on how the Biden campaign is considering, if in fact former President Trump does get convicted, trying to brand him with that convicted label. There's this interesting piece that I know caught your eye too in the New York Times, talking about how politically disengaged Americans have leaned toward Mr. Trump, with this big question hanging over it. If they can get more engaged, could President Biden win them back? I wonder if this trial is doing enough to get those people to tune in, especially when numbers show that about a third of Americans really just aren't following news coverage of this hush money trial to a big degree.
Right. I don't think this trial is what moves the needle for people who are fatigued burnt out and fed up by politics, because what they hear from the periphery, from the outside, is that, oh, this is all part of the problem. But that idea of fatigue and political disengagement is one of the biggest stories of the year.
Yeah.
And it will make a huge difference in this election. I like to think that it's really kind of the result of almost a decade of the Trump effect in politics, supercharging his supporters, but exhausting everyone else and causing a lot of people to tune out. Whether Biden is the right political figure to help people tune back in, I think that's a question that we will study for years to come.
To that point, Brian, a senior campaign official for the Biden campaign tells me just in a conversation overnight, one of the things they're fighting against is the idea of natural amnesia that happens when Donald Trump, as much as he's been on the national stage, has not been in the White House for the past 4 years. And so to some degree, this is about reintroducing or at least reiterating the clear contrast between these two candidates.
Right, and this is all a full circle moment with this trial, because when was the first time we saw that nothing would, quote unquote, stick to Donald Trump? What was the first moment where it seemed like the natural laws of political gravity didn't apply? Yeah. Access Hollywood tape, and that's what's being litigated back in the courtroom today.
But I would argue you could even go further back than that, Brian, right, to the days after he came down that golden escalator when he was attacking, for example, of essentially a war hero in John McCain, et cetera. But to your point, it is a full circle moment there, it seems. Brian Stelter, thank you so much. It's good to see you. A lot of other big headlines tonight. We're going to catch you up on all of it when we pick up our regular programming right after the break.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.